Gabe Cook here with Debate Kansas City. Today I'm going to be talking to you about a common argument made by the negative called topicality. Topicality is as it sounds. It's where the negative argues that the affirmative is not on topic, and they argue further that because they're not on topic, they deserve to lose the debate. You see, each year with policy debate we're given a resolution, and that resolution is supposed to dictate debate for the entire year. Affirmative teams are given latitude to come up with some type of idea, some type of case that falls under the guise of the resolution. Sometimes affirmative teams will test the boundaries of that resolution. They might argue a case that some people go, I'm not really sure that's a part of this topic. When that happens, it's called the topicality argument. The negative says you in fact are not a part of the topic. It's basically cheating because we were given this topic, we tried to prepare to debate on the negative for all the different cases that we thought were a part of the topic, and guess what? You're not on the list. You're not one of the cases that we prepared to debate, therefore we think that you should lose the round. Now, topicality has 4 parts. I'm going to go through and explain each one of those 4 parts, and I'm going to try and use an example, a mock resolution, in order to do it. Here is the mock resolution we're going to use. Resolved, our school should substantially improve its cafeteria food. That's our mock resolution. Resolved, our school should substantially improve its cafeteria food. Okay? Let's say that in this debate, an affirmative team says, here's our case. We think that with all meals, there should be a no sugar juice box drink added as a choice for all cafeteria meals. So in order to substantially improve cafeteria food at our school, we are going to add basically no sugar juice boxes as a choice for everybody in the school. Okay? Now, if that was the affirmative and you were the negative, you might say juice boxes. I don't know if that counts as substantially improving cafeteria food. I think I'm going to argue that they're actually not topical. Well, here's how you do it, those 4 parts. Let's start with part 1, the interpretation. The interpretation is where the negative offers their interpretation of the topic. And what they will do is typically find a key word in the resolution that they believe the affirmative violates in some way. And they will define that key word. So in this case, we would probably look to the word substantial. Remember, the resolution was that our school should substantially improve its cafeteria food. Well, if I was making this argument, I might define substantial as, according to Merriam-Webster's online, ample to satisfy and nourish a substantial meal. Okay, so there's my interpretation of what substantial means. It has to be ample, it has to satisfy, it has to nourish, and its example is a substantial meal. So that's how I have defined substantial. That's my interpretation of the resolution. That leads us into part 2, the violation. The violation is where you explain how it is that the affirmative case does not meet your interpretation of the resolution. You believe that you've defined this key word, you've given your interpretation of what the resolution means. Here's your explanation of why it is the affirmative does not meet that. Now, in our example, where the affirmative is providing juice boxes, I might say my definition says it has to be ample and it has to nourish. A juice box in and of itself is not ample, it does not nourish, and it is certainly not a substantial meal. The resolution is really asking the affirmative team to change the way food is served, to change the food itself in the cafeteria, not to just add a little juice box. So I've argued, here's my definition of substantial. It must be ample. It really means to change the whole meal. And guess what? All the affirmative does is add a juice box. Therefore, they have failed to meet our interpretation of the topic, which leads us then into part number 3, the standards. The standards are the reasons that you prefer the affirmative interpretation. They're the reasons that this topicality argument should matter so much. And there's several different standards that you can go by. Let's talk about a few. First, limits. Limits is a very common standard to be used. And basically what you're arguing is that we have this topic. And if we allow everything under the sun to be topical, it makes this topic huge. And the negative teams can't predict all these different affirmative cases, therefore they can't do the adequate research beforehand in order to be prepared. If there are not predictable limits, affirmatives are going to win every single debate because it's impossible for the negatives to be prepared to win any debate. So you argue limits are good. If we had a topic that allows for 2,000 cases, that would be far too many. If we had a topic that allowed for 50 to 100 cases, you know what? That would be a lot better, because it would be much easier for the negative to predict what it is the affirmative team is going to say. Limits good because they create the best debate. Now let's talk about another one. Ground. Ground is an argument that if we allow the affirmative in, if we ignore the negative interpretation and we allow the affirmative case in, it doesn't leave the negative team with enough decent ground to debate against them. In our example, where the affirmative is saying juice boxes are the same as a substantial change to cafeteria food, the negative might say there's not enough ground. It's really hard to argue against offering kids the option of a sugar-free juice box. How are we supposed to debate against that? And how is that going to be a good debate? If you were asking us to change the entire meal, or if the affirmative actually changed the entire meal, we would have a lot more ground to argue against. The debate would be much better. It would be more fair. But because you've chosen this tiny little juice box case, you've made the debate unfair and you've taken away all kinds of reasonable ground. For example, most affirmative cases under this topic where you're improving cafeteria food might do something like make food more healthy. That might cost a bunch of money. And that would be reasonable negative ground, would be to argue, you know what, this is going to cost too much money. But instead, the affirmative has just done these juice boxes. Juice boxes don't cost very much money, so it's taken away a potential argument that the negative could make. So there's another one, ground. Another standard that you might have is bright line. Bright line is typically where you offer some very clear, usually quantity-based definition. So if we had defined substantial to mean 50%, that you have to change 50% of the food in a cafeteria, then that might set a very, very clear bright line. The definition that I used in our interpretation, our example interpretation, really didn't offer a clear bright line. Bright line definitions would be needed in order to have a bright line standard. But basically what it does, it sets a clear-cut number. So if you have a definition with a clear-cut number, one of your reasons to prefer one of your standards is going to be a bright line. Here's another standard that you could throw out there. Education. You would argue, hey, you know what, this resolution, it sets the topic in such a way that we're supposed to be educated about important issues. And when you try to run this small little affirmative case, it gets away from educating us about what we really want to be educated about. In this cafeteria food case example, we're supposed to be educated about what it is that's going in and nourishing our bodies as school children, what it is that's in our meals, not diverting our attention to having some little juice box option. That's really not the critical education that we need to be getting. The affirmative is running a strategic case, and it hinders education, it hinders debate. Now, let's talk about the fourth part of a topicality argument. The voter. The voter is where you say, look, we've got these standards that show our interpretation is really the best one in the round. Now here's why those standards and our argument all comes together and culminates into a voting issue. There's a bunch of different reasons that you could give as a voting issue as well. One of the most common is called jurisdiction. Basically, jurisdiction means, hey, they fall outside of the topic. You as the judge, you're supposed to only vote for a topical case. It's not within your jurisdiction to vote for the affirmative, therefore you should throw it out. Here's another one you might give. Abuse. And it could be in-round abuse, or it could be potential abuse. Here's what it means. It means that the affirmative case is abusive to the negative, because there's not enough ground in order to have a fair debate within that debate round. This juice box example that we've given, you might argue, hey, juice boxes, way too small of an issue for us to have reasonable arguments. We tried to stand up here and say that it would cost too much money, but they said, you know what, juice boxes, hey, they barely cost anything. And as the negative, you would say that proves in-round abuse. We should be able to make a cost argument. This is supposed to be substantial. If it's not substantial, then it's abusive to us because we're losing critical arguments that we could have. Finally, competing interpretations. You would argue we interpret the topic one way, the affirmative interprets the topic the other way. If we prove our interpretation is best for debate, then you should vote for us. So, recap, we had 4 parts of topicality. Hope the example and hope the explanation of those 4 parts were useful. Thanks, take care.